So now we're going to continue sewing our bag. There are 3 things that I'm going to pin up right now and sew all at once. We're going to do the side seams to our bag, and I simply folded it in half, and we're just folded it in half, and I'm lined up here so that I look like this instead of this. We want it to be nice and together like this instead of like this. So beautifully lined up. About every 3 to 4 fingers is when I pin. My street lights need to be standing, not laying down. Now, most people take their pins out as they sew. I don't. So if you're one of those who does not take your pins out while you sew, then you are going to have to make your pins stand, because you can't sew past the pins if they're laying down. And by laying down, again, I mean like this. That's laying down, this is standing up. Okay, we are going to sew each of these seams from here to here on each of the seams at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. We're going to back stitch when we start and we stop, so the seam will remain sewn. If we don't back stitch, if you go like this, the whole seam will rip apart. We're going to use a regular stitch, so your needle on your sewing machines starts out facing to the left slightly. That's where we're going to keep it, but I don't use a 2.5 stitch length. I use a 3, because if I have to seam rip this, 3 is so much easier to seam rip than 2.5. I'm also going to show you, after we're done sewing these side seams, how to sew up the straps. So we're going to do all of that in one shot.
All right, good.
Okay, so we're going to back stitch a few stitches and then back stitch a few stitches. Notice, because of the thickness of this, it didn't want to suck into the machine. That's a normal problem to have. That's why I held on to this and I pulled it so that it helped suck it through the machine. If I didn't do that and it just stayed in one place forever, I'd have a giant knot underneath this and it would be stuck to the machine. And you'd be yelling, "Miss Blend, my machine's broken, I don't know what's wrong with it." That's because you kind of have to help it along a little bit. 5/8 inch seam allowance. Back stitch. Forgot to push the button. There we go, we made it.
Yay!
I was pushing like right next to the button. I'm not used to this machine. I have an ancient machine at home that I use. This one's much nicer. Take a look, that's our 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now I'm gonna sew up my other 3 seam allowances. You don't need to watch me do that, but I will show you the straps right now. And then we're gonna press at the ironing board. So with the straps, I wanna do an edge stitch. I wanna sew it right next to the edge of the fabric, which is why it's called an edge stitch. I need to close this up so that it stays closed. Now, if you didn't iron it well enough, or you don't think you're proficient in sewing and you wanna pin this whole thing, you may. Those of you who feel comfortable just sewing without pins, that's fine too. Just make sure you have a nice pressing on this to make that happen. Now, you can keep your machine needle where it is, left facing, but you're gonna have less of this strap underneath the machine foot, which is gonna make it not wanna go through as easily. So one trick I always use when I am doing an edge stitch is I will center the needle, even though, you know, technically we're supposed to be sewing with needle to the left. because I'm the one who's guiding it where I want it to go. I'm not using the markings on the machine, so I can put the needle wherever. So I'm gonna center the needle, and now all of a sudden, look how much more fabric is underneath. See, this is more fabric underneath the presser foot versus if I were doing it left facing right there. So it's gonna make it easier for me to sew. It's gonna slip and slide less. Now I am going to, for the first few stitches, hold on to this too, especially if I can tell that it's too thick for this to start running through the machine, then I can give it that little yank I told you about. So now we're just guiding. Of course, I forgot to turn it to 3. Make sure you turn it to 3 because it always starts at 2.5. My 2 fabrics were trying to slip and slide, so that's why I lifted the presser foot to fix that. And that would be the benefit to pinning it instead of just going with your iron piece. Because if you're a novice sewer, you might not think, oh, I can just leave the needle in, lift it up, fix it with my hands, put it back down and keep going. So I can now sew this on this side too if I want to.
Did we backstitch on that?
We did backstitch on it. I just didn't say I'm backstitching.
Just making sure.
Yes, absolutely. Backstitch both ends. Basically, every time you're sewing a stitch, unless it's decorative like the quilting, you have to backstitch when you start and stop. But yeah, if I want to, I can sew it on this side too, just because that's decorative. So this technically wouldn't have to be backstitched on this side. It's all up to you whether or not you want to see 1 line of stitching or 2. But this side has to be done to close up the strap, so that it doesn't want to flop open anymore. Now, Mrs. Marion, this is your bag. Do you want it done on the other side
I
too?
would like a decorative stitch.
Okay, decorative stitching happening now. So look at this. We're just simply gonna go. We don't have to backstitch, you know, I have to. I love backstitching. I lied to you. You don't have to, but I do. And actually, Mrs. Marion, if you can get in on this.
She's throwing stuff around, girls.
Whoopsies. You can actually see that I am guiding this edge right here with this notch right here that is like etched onto the foot. So I am actually guiding, but I'm choosing where I want to guide it. So there you go.
See, both sides are stitched. It's a nice decorative finishing touch, giving it that more professional look.
That's right. And then when I was sewing, you can see on this side that both fabrics weren't 100% lined up with each other from the iron. So I sewed far enough in for you to be able to catch both fabrics. So make sure you do sew far enough in to catch both fabrics.
Or else it'll just flop open.
That's right. We've sewn our side seams to all the bag pieces, and we've sewn up our straps too. So the next step is going to be to press.
Okay.
Okay, so I grabbed a different ironing board because this one I could actually show you how to do this properly. That little one, the stands get in the way. So what I want to do is iron my seams open, which we've done before. So make sure this is nice and flat, and this is nice and flat. You want this open, but you want to pull this nice and taut. So I'm going to start at this end, pulling it nice and taut as I go.
You would have ironed open your seams on your quilt squares that we made. So think back. And your boxy bags, but quilt squares I know you all did already.
And see, you can pull on the fabric to get it nice and taut. And you can see, I'll open this up so that you can see it. So beautifully open. And then when you come on this side, I'll show you the difference between the two seams, one that's ironed and one that's not. Ironing makes a project look like it's professional. Not ironing, this is not ironed.
See how puckered it is?
Looks homemade, not ironed. Now look at this side.
All flat.
Nice and beautifully
Ooh.
flat. So that is the purpose of pressing. It just makes your project look professional. So I'm gonna do all 4 of my side seams, and then we're gonna sew up our corners, and then we're gonna add our straps, and this is done.
Woohoo!
So it's a really simple project.
Okay.
But we are going to be pinning our corner pieces. So I just take the 2 corner pieces and grab onto them like that. And you've done this with the boxy bag technically. And I'm trying to get this centered. So if I just grab these corner pieces and have them, you know, folded right where they meet, that will become centered. So not rocket science. You want to pin your seam allowance down so it doesn't move. Then I'm going to take this and just make this flat across. And I'm going to pin all the way to the corner there. Make this flat across like that. And pin all the way to the corner. Now, when you go to sew this with your 5/8 inch seam allowance, that's going to be, well, you can see that width. So that's going to be right here. You don't want to sew it from here to here. You want to sew it from right here to all the way
on the edge.
Otherwise you'll have this giant pucker when you turn that right side out. So we're going to pin up, we pinned this corner, we're going to pin this corner, that corner, and that corner. So pin all 4 corners. That's right. So okay, so I have set my machine to a 1.5 of 3, and I let it be on the left because I'm guiding to a specific line on the machine. We are doing 5/8. Like I said before, you need to go all the way from this fold right here to this fold there, but you're gonna notice when you put it into the machine that you can't see where the 5/8 inch marking is if you start all the way at the fold. So you can go in a little bit and not start at the fold and do a little bit of sewing, and then you can backstitch all the way. I know that's a giant amount of backstitching, but if that's how you have to start because we're novice sewers and we can't eyeball the seam allowance yet, that is absolutely acceptable. Just hope you don't have to seam rip that out. And at the end it's easier because you've already been going 5/8. So you do get to the point where you recognize the amount of excess fabric you have right here in comparison to the side of the presser foot without having to look at the marking on the machine. But until you get there, you know, it's kind of hard to eyeball the places where guiding is difficult. So not a problem if you can't eyeball that yet, because we do want it to be a true 5/8. So do make sure that you get it at 5/8 and all the way to that corner so that you don't have a giant pucker when you turn it right side out.
And then you guys can see it's all the way.
That's right. All the way. And it sews pretty fast once you have it
Oh yeah.
all pinned together.
These will make excellent presents for Christmas, guys, if you need a sewing project at home. We can grade them. You're going.
All right, so we are gonna sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have both layers separated from each other. I've had plenty of times where people sew the bag shut together because they sew both layers together. So they're separated from each other. Gonna hold on here, 1/4 inch seam allowance, because at the top, the two bag pieces will be sewn together at 5/8. So you will not see this stitching. So if it's ugly, if you use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, doesn't matter. No one will ever see it. So you
This
might
is
have
pretty
to help
thick.
it along. Yes. I'm just going to go all the way back and then all the way forward again. So 3 times. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to go back to where I started to make cutting my strings easier. Because I can take all of them and cut them at once. So I'll do that with every single one of my straps. Again, don't put the bag together like this and sew it, because you've now sewn your bag together. So
Open it up.
Yes.
And all of your machines should have this open part right here where it can tuck under the open bag.
Yes. Which I actually had to remove this to make that happen, which is perfectly fine.
All right, so Mrs. Bland is going to do this 4 times, twice for each strap, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and cut her thread. Go.
Okay, so notice I have both my bags turned right side up.
Right
I'm
side,
gonna
right side.
Leave this one the way it is, and I'm gonna turn this one inside out because I want this right side to face this right side. So turn this one inside out.
No, it's ugly.
No, yeah, it's ugly side. I didn't tell you guys to leave a hole open for a few reasons. One being it's easier to press a seam allowance if you don't have a hole, a gaping hole. But now we need to open up a hole. So if you sewed with a really small stitch, it's gonna be hard to seam rip this. So just rip yourself a little hole, because that's how we're turning this all right side out. I like to, every few stitches, just cut a stitch. I can show you all kinds of ways to seam rip, but this is gonna be a nice, easy way that won't accidentally cut your fabric. Now, see, I've cut all kinds of little stitches. Simply just have to pull it apart.
Woo!
Then I can grab all of my little, I call them nerds, like when you're erasing something and you have the nerds. Not talking about the men in your lives. Anyways, we're gonna stick this bag inside of this bag. It's gonna start out looking very unstructured. I want you to line up your seam allowances first. See, we have seam allowance and seam allowance. Take it and line it up from all the way down here, all the way up. That way, and hold on to it real good, and then pin it. Make sure it gets pinned open, because you want them to match each other, and you're going to use a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So if you just matched it up here, they won't match each other down here. So again, I'll show you how to do that. Seam allowance, take it and just match it up the seam. And I'll try to get it so that this matches too. There we go. Hold on to it real good with your hand. I guess I should put this over here. Pin it open. You don't want that twisted seam allowance, so pin it open. Now, we're just gonna pin all the way around the top of our bag, just matching the raw edges to each other. And here's where I was saying, if you put the straps on this instead of this, you have all this weight hanging right here where the strap would be, and it would make a pucker. So it's easier to sew when you don't have all of that weight on the flimsy lining or the floppy lining. So turn it around and do the same thing on the other side.
I think they are all saying this is so much easier than the boxy bag.
I really should change the order of these projects, and then all these videos will go, just like your boxy bag. And they'll go, what boxy bag?
What's that?
We haven't sewn a boxy bag yet. There we go. Now
All
we're going to
pinned.
sew around the circumference at 5/8 inches. Whenever I get to a strap, as I'm sewing, I'm going to go like this. And then I'm going to go because
Okay.
I want to add even more strength so the bag doesn't rip apart at the straps. It's the worst thing ever when your bags rip apart at the straps. I'm sure you guys know this with your lovely clear backpacks that you had to use for the past few years.
Go.
Okay, sew the circumference. It doesn't really matter where on the bag you start, just as long as you finish in the same place. Okay. Do back stitch. And this is so thick you might have to help it along a little bit. And keep it nice and flat. And if you see that puckers are going to happen, you just kind of have to stop and readjust. I'm on a strap right now. And to be completely honest, if you are not on the 5/8 inch seam allowance, that's not the end of the world. It just makes your bag a little bit longer or shorter depending on where you are, which direction. But you don't want it to be so small that your bag starts ripping apart.
Or that you see where your straps were sewn, so.
Exactly. You want to be further this direction than your 1/4 inch to start out with. You want to be consistent with whatever you choose. So just go 5/8. See, I can see a pucker is coming, so I pulled it nice and taut. Something that helps with puckers, if you don't feel confident in fixing them as you go, is pin, 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 pin. More pins than what I used, and that will take care of those puckers. I think I just went over a strap again. Yes, I did.
Gotta back it up, back it up.
Sometimes you don't even realize there's a strap that you've just gone over. Now you have to meet up with your previous stitching and just back stitch on top of that stitching. So you have a very secure seam. There we go. We can take our pins out. For some reason, for some reason our video kind of screwed up, so you didn't get to see me turn the bag right side out through this hole. So literally I just pulled the bag through the hole to get it right side out, which I'm sure you guys can figure out. And then you just put your bag,
Your lining in your bag.
in there nice and neat. And then we have already pressed this too. That's why it looks so beautiful. So you're just gonna go around it.
Yours will not look so smooth because technical
It looks
difficulties.
super bubbly to start out with. So basically when you press it, it's okay to see some of the outside on the inside, but you don't want to see the inside on the outside. And when you go to press it, let's say I'm pressing this area, you want to push real hard. And as you're pushing, going slowly, go heel, tip to heel again, doing the
Like your
whole
whole iron.
thing, going all the way around your bag.
So the whole thing all the way around. You won't see blue out here, but you may see paisley inside or whatever your fabric choices are. Okay.
There we go.
Yay!
If you feel like it's still bubbly looking or you don't trust it to stay down, you can sew right here,
Would that be 1/4 inch again?
about 1/4 inch all the way around the
You guys
bag.
don't know how hot this bag is.
The other thing that we can do is to keep the lining in the bag. I'm going to show you stitching in the ditch.
Stitch
But
in
you're
the
going to
ditch.
have to use the same color thread as the fabric. Basically, you want to pull this as taut as you can and get right into that crease. And you really only need to do about this to just help the lining not pull out of the bag when you're taking, let's say, a folder out of here. So I'm going to show you how to close up the hole and stitch in the ditch. So I put the bag back together, the lining's inside, and this stitching in the ditch is just going to prevent the lining from pulling out if I take like a folder or a binder out of this bag.
And so we changed the machine.
I did. We changed the thread to a color that actually matches. We only need to do like that much of the bag on both seam allowances, so it doesn't really matter that we don't have a ton of thread. The other thing is I centered my needle and I'm leaving it at 2.5 because I don't really want this to be seen from the outside. So I'm gonna take my fabric and pull it nice and taut as I go. But this is an instance where you're gonna use the hand wheel to get the needle exactly in that seam. Now, put the foot down and just go a little bit, back stitch. Okay. And then you're literally just going to be watching that seam where your needle is. You're watching the needle go into the space between the two fabrics. So you have to be real slow. If you don't have the ability to turn the speed down on your sewing machine, pretend like you have an egg underneath your foot that you don't want to crack. Okay, so now I've done enough. I'm going to back stitch. Okay, now take our cut from the top first because then it'll pull from the bottom. See, you can't tell that I sewed there at all.
Nope, you sure can't.
Because it's right in there. You can't even see it when I pull it taut. So that is the sign of a good back stitch, or a good
Stitch in the ditch.
stitch in the ditch. And notice how on this side, it wasn't perfect. You can see that. That's okay.
It's on the inside.
It's very close to being. Now, if this fabric was pulled real far over, that would be a problem. But because it's so close, it doesn't matter. So don't stress out about that.
Do not turn in stuff to Mrs. Bland with hanging threads. She doesn't like them.
It's true, it's my pet peeve. I cut my threads like the thread Nazi as I'm sewing. I really do. So, to sew up the hole you made, just grab it out of the bag, and we are going to do the even slip stitch, also called the ladder stitch, if you didn't know that. There are many names for many of these stitches we've been doing. I am going to take it and get the knot that I made hidden inside this hole. I'm going to start it, see right there. So my seam actually is right there where it's still together from the black thread. So I'm starting it a little bit into the seam allowance. So now what I want to do is I want to go fold, 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 fold. So I'm actually going to go back in here, but I'm going right next to it because if I go right through this hole, it's just going to take my thread out. So I'm going to go right next to it, like there. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to go into the fold. Oops, there we go. Like this.
Right down the crease that you guys had previously pressed in, if it's not showing up on video.
Then, and that's good to know too, because you just want to go to fold, fold, or crease, 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 crease. So exactly where I come out of this fabric, I want to go into the fold or the crease across from it. Notice how I did the same amount right here and right here. That's why it's called the even slip stitch. This is what you'll use to sew up stuffed animals too. So exactly where I came out of here, I go across from it. It's also why it's called the ladder stitch, because it makes the rungs of a ladder when you pull it apart. So right where it comes out of here, you go into the fold across from it. And this should be completely invisible when you're finished with it. But notice when I pull it apart, it does look like a little ladder. And that's the even part of it too, because if you did the uneven, you wouldn't have a ladder.
Your ladder would knock you off.
So next semester, if we come back to school and we're able to make stuffed animals, now every once in a while, especially when I'm making something that I don't want, like when you're sewing, if you accidentally break a stitch, the whole thing is now having to be re-sewn. So to prevent that from happening, I'm just going to take my thread, my needle, and go into it. And I'm just going to make it, pull it nice and taut. And then I'm just going to make a knot stitch. That way, if this accidentally breaks open, that knot is going to help it not completely
It's like its own
fall
little
apart.
back stitch.
Yes, that's right. So when I was in high school learning to sew, my sewing teacher always said 3 stitches in a knot. Okay, so now you're gonna see that I'm going up into the area where I've previously sewn.
With the machine.
With the machine, that's right. And I just want this to be nice and reinforced. And now I'm just gonna go right here and grab a little bit of the fabric, and I'm gonna make my knot stitch, but I'm gonna do it a different way this time. Notice, here's the part that's coming out of the fabric, and this is the part that's in the needle. I'm gonna take the part that's coming out of the fabric and wrap it 1, 2, 3 times around the needle. Then I'm gonna pull it down like that, and I'm gonna hold it with my finger. Then I'm gonna still hold it really tight with my finger and just pull this through that. That represents a knot that has been tied 3 times the other way, that you guys are probably more used to using. That's it. So now the lining's gonna stay in. You can see at the bottom that it still wants to look a little saggy baggy, but it's not gonna pull out of my bag when I'm pulling things in and out of it.
Look at that.
Such a cute little bag. Nice fabric choices, Mrs. Marion.
That was Walmart for you.
And notice both straps are in the exact same spot as each other.
All
That's very
lined
important.
up.
All right, so that is our